From horrifying diseases and destructive battles to mass interrogations and inquisitions, these are some of the most brutal events in medieval history. Up first is the Mongol conquest. Nomadic tribes from the Central Asian steppes were a devastating force throughout history. From the Roman Empire to the Byzantines to the medieval Europeans, from Scythians to Huns to the Mongols, the speed and ferocity of these raiding bands were highly destructive and effective. But Genghis changed all that. No longer would the Eurasian nomads conduct lightning raids to extort ransoms. Genghis would build an empire. This definitionally meant the outright eradication of all peoples who did not surrender and join his empire. It began with the Mongols themselves, with Genghis wiping out half of the Mongol tribes before unification. Then, as they conquered across China, Persia, and even into Hungary and Russia, this level of eradication only continued. 10% of the entire world's population was destroyed, or some 60 million people in Eurasia. For 160 years, the Mongols conquered and ruled their empire. Next is the Black Plague. Beginning just before the fall of the Mongol Empire, the Black Plague was utterly devastating. For 7 years, it raged across Eurasia and is estimated to have wiped out half of Europe's population, or some 50 million people. The plague was everywhere, and the horror of it is truly difficult to explain. If you aren't squeamish, look up for yourself what the bubonic plague does to people. Then imagine everyone you know, your entire village, and all the villages around you are infested with it. It truly was apocalyptic in its scope and had massive ramifications for the rest of history. The church, for example, lost most of their priests as they had to provide last rites to the sick and were often the ones to treat the sick anyways, which some estimate led to massive corruption as all of the quote-unquote good priests perished. It was viewed as a holy punishment as well and encouraged mass destruction of property and life in a vain attempt to appease the wrathful god that placed this plague upon the land. Next is the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was the largest scale, longest lasting, and most well-documented state-sponsored enhanced interrogation effort in human history. For 400 years, from 1478 to 1834, the entire apparatus of the Spanish state was built around a massive interrogation ring designed to root out Jews, Muslims, heretics, and other undesirables. This was, to put it crudely, the best possible situation for violent interrogation to work, and yet, just like today, it still didn't. With all the time in the world, all the resources available to the government, and all the vile cunning the worst of humanity could muster, the best they ever got was vague and unconfirmable information, or outright falsehoods at worst. The issue is, no one was consciously lying. Surprise, surprise, shattering someone's mind with years of aggressive interrogation only succeeds in making a person desperate to please and avoid pain. They don't even know they're lying. Their brain is so broken, they have no notion or connection to reality, only what stops their torment. Next is the Youth Crusade. Thanks to massive religious fervor fomented by previous crusades and hateful Christian rhetoric, several thousand youths gathered and marched from France and Germany to Jerusalem. This was intended as a sort of colonization and cleansing of ethnic and religious groups in the Holy Land. But this isn't the 19th, 20th, or 21st century where you could just take a train. No, all these youths had to march for hundreds and hundreds of miles. The tales of horror are truly disturbing, and despite thousands of youths embarking on the journey, none are recorded to have made it to the Holy Land. They perished of disease, starvation, or from being overworked. But for those who reached Italy, just a ferry's ride away from the Holy Land, something even worse happened. The boats they paid to take them to Jerusalem took them instead to Tunisia, into the waiting arms of well-paying slavers. Next is the Siege of Jerusalem. The First Crusade was declared to take the Holy Land from the Muslims and Jews who occupied it, and as always with religious wars, the cruelty, devastation, and destruction was immense. Under threat of a Fatimid army to the south, the Crusaders finally broke into Jerusalem and began a wholesale slaughter of its inhabitants. Be they Muslim, Jew, or Eastern Christian, none were spared and thousands were put to the sword. Irrespective of gender or age, the Crusaders destroyed everything they came across. Crusader accounts of the battle describes them butchering their way up the Temple Mount and wading through ankle-deep blood from all of the slaughter. Next is the harrying of the North. Over the winter of 1069 to 1070, William the Conqueror conducted a series of military campaigns across the north of England in order to subjugate the Danes, Anglo-Saxons, and Anglo-Scandinavians that had rebelled against his rule. Though he managed to pay the Danes off to leave the land, the rest of the rebels refused to stop fighting. However, they also refused refused to meet William in open battle, knowing his larger army would destroy them. And so, unable to decisively eliminate the rebels, William engaged in a horrifying spree of planned starvation, mass elimination, and outright banditry to quell the rebellion. And by quell, I mean destroy anyone who could have raised a hand against him. Next is the Cathar Crusade. The Cathar were a Christian sect of southern Europe, most populous in southern France and northern Italy. They had a dualistic belief between God, who was good, and the demiurge, which was bad. But Pope Innocent III, not exactly innocent, declared them heretics and non-believers, deserving of the worst of punishments. Under the promise of receiving Cathar land, many French nobles raised armies, and from 1209 to 1229, between 200,000 and 1 million Cathars were exterminated, with the remaining being forced into hiding, and eventually leading to the elimination of the Cathar faith. Next is the German Crusade. Occurring in 1096, the German Crusade, as it is known, was not actually a formally declared crusade, but instead more of an explosion in anti-Semitic violence, often described as the first event in a long chain of violence culminating in the 30s and 40s. It was the fervor of Christian nationalism, the Crusades, and the fact that the Jews were mostly the last non-Christians in Europe that led to this horrific devastation. The true casualty count is not known, but thousands were destroyed at the very least, as roving bands of Christian soldiers hunted through each city and town. Next is Ayadia. Following the fall of Acre, the Third Crusade had the Muslim forces under Saladin in retreat. The two leaders, Saladin and King Richard, decided to open negotiations following the battle, with Richard demanding the return of the True Cross, 100,000 gold pieces, and all Christian prisoners in exchange for the release of all Muslim prisoners. But neither side wanted to give up their advantage and lose their prisoners first, causing negotiations to break down. When the deadline passed, the Crusaders lined up 3,000 Muslim prisoners in front of the watching Muslim army and put them all to the sword. Saladin tried to attack to prevent the mass destruction of life, but it failed to stop the deaths. In retribution, all Christian prisoners were also put to the sword, and as news of the horror spread across the Muslim world, revenge against Christians of all sorts was taken. Many Crusaders were sickened and confused by the massive destruction of life ordered by their king for seemingly no reason, but few spoke up. And finally is the Battle of Visby. As part of the Dano-Swedish Wars of the 1300s, Danish King Valdemar IV landed a well-equipped army on the shore of Gotland. What followed would be one of the most one-sided and horrific battles in medieval history, while still being able to call it a battle. The Goots of Gotland were mostly farmers and were poorly equipped compared to their invaders. In a series of brutal skirmishes culminating in the Battle of Visby, several thousand Gutnish farmers and soldiers were destroyed, with modern estimates reaching an upper limit of 3,500 deaths. This was incredible at the time. The Danes suffered casualties in the low 300s. Those were the most brutal events of medieval history. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.